all gods who spurned anyone that wasn't a male highborn. Tourneys were a waste of money and resources and a game for boys rather than men. Politics was an invitation to be stabbed in the back, it went on. Caitlin knew he loved her and respected her, but he hated how she had been raised to be quiet and obedient first to her father and then her husband, and how she had been sold off to a stranger in exchange for an army. Truth be told, she could not find it in herself to resent any of what Ned spoke of. How could she, when it is her upbringing and her father's transaction with the Starks that had led to her being married to perhaps the best man in the Seven Kingdoms and their 3 children? All the same, she agreed with her husband's desire to only put forward marriage recommendations once the children were old enough to make their own decisions and let them have the last say. That said, Caitlin thought it was high time to introduce more entertainment to the North. Ned wanted her to be more involved in the affairs of the North. So be it. It had taken her a few years to come up with anything with the potential for success. Considering nothing could have Southern origins, she had had to come up with new entertainment ideas from scratch, but she finally had a few things to put forward to lighten life up in the North. Placing the letter in one of her desk's drawers, the redhead delicately withdrew a small binder of papers, careful not to crumple or damage her plans in any way, before making her way out of her rooms and striding confidently towards Benjamin Solar, wanting the opinion and perhaps blessing of a northerner before she made her plans a reality. Dear brother. It seems I will not be gone as long as last time, as the entirety of the 7 kingdoms has gathered their forces to go against the Iron Islands. I expect this whole affair to be over within a month or 2, however the king has demanded a tourney at Lannisport to celebrate our future victory, so I will likely return in 5 months' time. Half a year at most, I would say. And the king? Isn't that a delicate subject? I feel like a hypocrite here, sparring and laughing with him, trusting him beside me on the battlefield as if I am not plotting to kill him and depose his family of the throne. The worst part, Benjamin, is that I do not even have to pretend sometimes. It is so easy to go back to those days in the Eyrie, where he was like a third brother to me and I to him. He still laughs, drinks and beds women enough to kill me with annoyance, but it is so easy to remember those days where it was fond exasperation that I felt. When I would roll my eyes at him and sigh while hiding my smile. Now, I look at him and I see 2 different men. I see the strong leader, passionate in all he does, charismatic and lovable despite his flaws, a man who still seeks to find joy in the simple things. And I see the fat slob who drinks until he passes out, who eats until he retches, who has dishonored his wife with a different woman each night, sometimes more than one at a time. I have been here and I see the man that looked upon the slaughter of children and condoned it. Our king is both of these men at once, brother, and it confuses me. It makes me ill. It has been so easy these past years, plotting against this man while his back was turned, but now he is here before me. It is all I can do not to flee to the nearest godswood and weep. But do not worry, brother. It makes me ill, but I do not turn my back on the memory of Lyanna Stark, Avelia Martell and Rhaenys and Aegon Targaryen. I do not turn my back on our little Jon. I know what Robert would do to our nephew should he find out his parentage, and as much as the thought of lying to the king leaves a sour taste in my mouth, lying to Jon would leave me on my knees gasping for breath. I'm sorry for rambling. So few people know about our plans and understand my old connection to Robert that I feel as though I am alone. Thank you for allowing me to confide in you, Benjamin. I leave for the Cape of Eagles as soon as I have finished this letter. This will be the last you receive from me until those Ironborn scum are brought to their knees. Take care of Caitlin, make sure she does not overextend herself in her state. In my absence, you are Lord Stark. Benjamin placed the letter on the desk before him, silently regarding it. Ned's words were reassuring. It was good to know that he would be home soon. As a third son, Benjamin had received even less training than Ned had, and he felt less than prepared whenever he had to take over as Lord of Winterfell, despite his experience with the role during Robert's rebellion. Still, it was winter, and though his brother had ensured no northerner would want for food or warmth, it still left him with a much more daunting task than during the rebellion, as it had been summer at the time. At least he wasn't alone this time, and Caitlin had taken to Winterfell like a duck to water, handling the household with the grace that he knew came from years of practice in Riverrun after her mother died. Even the parts about King Robert soothed an internal worry that he had had for years. He had always known that this venture of Ned's would be conflicting for him, the two having been as close as brothers before the rebellion. So much so that in his youth, he had sometimes been jealous of the affection between Ned and Robert, thinking the latter was trying to steal his brother from him. It was good to know that despite the inner turmoil, Ned was still just as convinced of his cause than he had been on the first day. Truthfully, Benjen didn't care if the North became independent. It would have little effect on him after all, he was not the Lord and he would not be the king. The only thing that had made him put all his effort behind this mad plan was the thought of Lionel's boy being brutally murdered as his half-siblings had been. Ned was right in that. Putting John in a position of power was the only way they could save him. Every secret had a way of coming out one day and he was sure that if they had insisted on keeping the boy's parentage a secret, it would end badly for them all. That said, they had put so much effort into the venture, so much coin and sweat had gone into making the North the best possible version of itself that it could be in such a short amount of time that it would be a shame to abandon the plan. A knock on the door to his solar had him hurriedly hiding the letter and pulling out some random books before calling for the visitor to enter. Benjen. Caitlin greeted, a small smile on her face as she held her growing belly with one hand and a stack of papers in the other. Are you busy? No, of course not, I was just. Looking down at the books he had opened to see exactly what he had pulled forward, he quickly snapped them shut as he realized that they were the copper pipe plans he had drawn up 6 years ago. No, I'm not busy. Please, have a seat. How is it I can help? Well, she began as she took a seat on the opposite side of the desk, perched just on the edge of the chair with her back straight as a rod as any good lady with manners should sit. At least that was what he had heard her tell Sansa. As you know, any good lady must have a project. Benjen blinked. No, he did not know that. Watching you and Ned change the North these past few years has been inspiring, and I decided that my project would also help invigorate the kingdom. So, over the past year or so, I have created new venues of entertainment and business that could be very profitable and enjoyable. Entertainment? Yes. The redhead placed her papers on the desk and Benjen saw that there were several stacks, each bound together by a different color ribbon piercing the corner. The South has tourneys and hunting parties, whereas in the North I know you look down on showcasing your battle techniques and hunting is for meat, not just a social gathering and sport. So I have created new kinds of entertainment that would be Northern only. I would like your opinion, as a Northerner, on them and if you think they would be successful. Frankly, Benjen was quite dumbfounded. Firstly, what was this about proper ladies need a project? Secondly, he honestly had expected Caitlin to just care for the household and the children, not come up with plans and inventions that could yield a financial profit as well as become a cultural activity. He nodded once, trying to keep his confusion and bafflement from his face as his sister-in-law's smile widened and she excitedly scooted her chair close to the desk. This first one, I had the inspiration when seeing a servant try and cross an ice-covered courtyard. Instead of going around and sticking close to the walls as I expected, she simply took a slight running start and slid across the entire space. As casually as walking. Yes, Benjen had seen the servants do that as well, and in his childhood, he and Lionel had often had great fun trying to emulate them. So, I was thinking we could make this into some sort of fun activity. Caitlin pushed forward her first stack, upon which Benjen saw a circular enclosure with wooden walls that would reach to chest height, with connotations all around the paper. It would be called an ice skating rink and people would go in to play and glide over the ice. Turning to the next page, there was a drawing of an odd kind of shoe. It was identical to the winter boots the Northerners wore, except that attached to the sole was a blade that ran the entire length of the foot. It seemed all the details had been thought of, how long it would take to create this rink, how much a pair of shoes would cost to make, how to make the ice sturdy and smooth with no perilous tripping hazards. Overall, a fairly cheap venture that the older woman had clearly thought through, even if she asked him to check over the business side of the plans. Even they were solid, a realistic price that would be affordable to the small folk and still see their spending on the shoes returned quickly. Benjen thought that it was indeed a splendid idea, it would be a great his at least with the children. The second idea, marked with a green ribbon, was not as great. A sort of game house where the adults could go to play their card and dice games with anyone else who was willing. Benjen quickly told her to discard that one. Who would pay to go somewhere specific to gamble when they could just do it in their houses or the street? This one, Caitlin began, holding the third and final stack tied with a red ribbon to her chest, a hesitant expression on her face. Is the most ambitious by far, and would be quite expensive to put in place. She slowly placed the stack, which was far thicker than the previous two, on the desk in front of Benjamin, showcasing an intricate design of some sort of circular arena similar to where Southern tournaments were held on the front page. Raising an eyebrow at the woman, he held his tongue, knowing that if she of all people knew of the Northern, and more importantly Ned's, disdain of tournaments, and trusting that she would know better than to present it as an idea for entertainment in the North. Indeed, as Benjamin turned each page and read their contents carefully, he realized that as similar as Caitlin's proposal was to a tournament, she had removed the main point of contention for the Northerners. Southern tournaments showcased a man's prowess in battle, his ability to wield a sword and shoot a bow, and his overall ability to defeat his enemies. In the North, when a man fights, he prefers his enemies to be unaware of his capabilities. In these Northern games, there was no joust, no archery and no melee. Instead, it was racing, whether on horseback, on foot, or in rowboats, and even a dog race, weightlifting, rock climbing, tug-of-war and other innocuous sports that had nothing to do with fighting. In fact, Caitlin had specified that even women were able to compete in the race sports. Benjamin's chest tightened with affection at that as he sent his sister-in-law a small smile. She had come so far from the prim lady that had arrived 6 years ago. She was still graceful, she was still elegant and poised, but she had come to learn and accept so many Northern customs, and Benjamin was proud of her. It had taken her a while to come around to the idea of women being allowed to fight or ride horses or hunt. It certainly wasn't common practice, but it was not frowned upon like it was in the South, and you could usually find a female archer or rider in a hunting group of 20 to 30 men. Benjamin cleared his throat as he remembered Caitlin waiting for his response in front of him. Well, you are certainly right that this is more ambitious and costly than the ice skating rink, he remarked, looking over the financial information on the final page. However, I see you have proposed we build one permanent arena on the outskirts of Winterfell, rather than rebuilding a temporary one every time we wish to hold these games like they do with Southern tournaments. That removes any time frame we would have imposed to remake the costs. That was my thought. Caitlin nodded, leaning forward slightly when he didn't outright reject her idea. I've of course been speaking with a few traders to get the figures and time frames, and one of the men was from Meereen, where they hold gladiator fights. Their arenas are permanent as their performances are fairly frequent. Nodding, Benjamin continued looking through the last page of the dossier. And how often are you thinking of holding these games? Perhaps once per year. The event would last for a week. The influx of people around Winterfell during that period would also bolster the profit of any businesses in Wintertown. Inns and whorehouses would profit the most, Benjamin thought, but others such as bakeries or fabric shops would definitely benefit as well. I think it's a great idea. Benjamin finally decided, placing the papers on the desk and looking back at his sister-in-law who had smiled wide at his words. It will take a while to set up of course, and I think perhaps this should be saved as a summer event the same as the ice skating is really only viable during winter, but I think it has the potential to be great. Thank you, Benjamin. Caitlin responded, standing and leaning over the desk to press a kiss to his cheek before she gathered her papers back into a neat pile. I shall visit the carpenters and shoemakers and get started on the setup of the ice rink right away. I received a letter from Ned saying the ravens of summer have been sent south of the neck, so winter will be over for us within the year at most. With that, the eager woman rushed from the room, leaving a still slightly bemused Benjamin in her wake. Clearly, she didn't need any of his help, so he was free to return to the joys of lordship until his brother returned. Chapter 11. The wolf's blood that ran through the veins of the Starks was much less obvious in Eddard than it was in his sister and older brother. Perhaps it had been tempered by his long fostering in the Vale, or perhaps it had just never been as strong in him as it was with them. It is what earned him the moniker the Quiet Wolf. Where Brandon was loud and rowdy and almost impossible to ignore, and Lyanna was willful and wild and stubborn to a fault, he was silent, brooding, he disappeared in the shadows. But Ned Stark had the wolf's blood all the same, as evidenced by the cold fury that overtook his mind, first when he came upon the brutalized forms of the Targaryen babes and their mother, then when his dearest sister struggled to tell her story while holding back tears and death, and most recently when he received the ravens telling of the Ironborn attacks on his people. those sworn to him and those under his protection. And the wolf's blood was powerful, it was overtaking and addictive. As such, the actual taking of the Iron Islands and the siege of Pike were almost a blur to the northern wolf. He remembered screaming. He remembered the warmth of blood as it splattered across his face. He remembered the pitiful resistance against his ancestral sword when it cut through his enemies, but he did not remember making his way through the bleak streets of Pike, up the hill to the great castle that stood upon the cliffs, nor did he remember Robert or himself ordering the tread buckets be brought forward and the launching of the attack against the walls of the castle. He didn't remember how many men he had killed, but with each one the ice in his veins both calmed and burned faster, demanding he take his due from the Krakens themselves. A great rumble sounded as one of the towers toppled, finally succumbing to the constant onslaught of their tread buckets. The clatter of rocks falling down the sides of the cliff and into the sea was unheard as the mainland armies screamed in triumph around him. As one, the men rushed forward, towards the hole in the castle wall that the fallen tower had previously occupied. Jorah Mormont, Lord of Bear Island since his father had joined the Night's Watch a year prior, was the first through the gap in the wall, rushing over the remains of unsteady rocks with Thoros of Myr and his flaming sword behind him. It was perhaps the uneven ground that saved the northerner's life, as one of the rocks moved under his weight, sending him tumbling and fighting for balance just as a Greyjoy soldier leapt from his hiding spot behind the wall and took a swing with his sword. A move that would have surely beheaded the bear had he not been suddenly sent to the ground. Thoros thrust his fiery sword straight through the enemy's chest as Jorah regained his balance and disappeared into the castle proper, the rest of the army not far behind him. "Let's get these cunts!" Robert cried beside him and a roar of approval sounded behind them. Once inside the walls, the fighting began anew. The hundreds of soldiers that had not been in the streets attempting to stop their advance were holed up in here, pouring from the door on the far end of the corridor. Ice rose and fell, parrying, blocking and killing. Men screamed in pain, in fear, in challenge, and blood spattered across walls and armor alike. There wasn't any sense to what was happening, just the roar of blood in his ears, the sight of a Greyjoy Kraken on someone's armor, and the swing of his sword. There was a flash of white to the side as Jaime Lannister rushed forward and intercepted an enemy soldier, momentarily taking up Ned's view before the Kingsguard disappeared among the multitude of soldiers around them once more. Along the corridor, through the door and up the stairs they continued until they arrived at one of the main bridge that connected the many towers of the castle. A group of 100 men or so stopped there, raising their shields to protect from arrows as they made their way across while the rest of the army continued upward. Bit by bit, the mainlander army split off at each corridor and bridge, eager to take the castle in its entirety and gut it of any Greyjoy loyalists. Slowly, each and every room they came across was emptied, the inhabitants either killed or taken prisoner, until they finally reached the main hall-cum-throne room where the Greyjoys were taking refuge with 100 guards. The guards were quickly dispatched, Lady Greyjoy and the children crying out and flinching with every life that was taken while Balon simply looked on and sneered in disgust from his false throne. Finally, they were the only ones left alive, and Ned's blood sang with the demand to take their heads, to end the Greyjoy line here and now. "Pike and the Iron Islands are ours, Your Grace," he said. "Aye." Robert was panting, gripping his hammer tightly and staring at the small cluster of people around the sea-stone chair with hunger in his eyes. Tearing his attention away, the king looked to the northerner and sighed with relief, a triumphant smile adorning his face. "Aye." A great cheer rang out behind them and soldiers began piling out of the room, only a select few remaining behind, Jorah Mormont, the members of the Kingsguard and Jon Arryn among them. Their attention turned back towards the Greyjoys as Robert stepped forward, twirling his hammer in his hands. "For your crimes against the crown and your king, you are to be executed as traitors," Robert said, matching the old Kraken's sneer with his own. "House Greyjoy will be wiped from existence and your seat will be given to a deserving lord." And suddenly Ned was elsewhere. A throne room much bigger and brighter than this one, after a different battle. At Pike, Jaime Lannister stepped forward to give the king his sword, but in the Red Keep he stood with his back against the wall and his head bowed. At Pike, Robert stepped up the stairs and swung the borrowed sword at Balon's neck, ignoring his family's screams, but in the Red Keep he stepped up the stairs and sat on a throne of swords. At Pike, Ned watched as the king raised the sword again to cut through the small body of Theon Greyjoy and end his line forever, But in the Red Keep he stared in horror at the mangled bodies of tiny children, unrecognizable if not for the white hair of the baby and the Targaryen cloak covering the toddler. "Robert, stop." Surprisingly it was Jon Arryn that spoke first, calling out to the king and raising a hand as if to restrain his former foster son even from across the hall. The occupants of the room froze and turned towards the hand of the king, and for a few moments the only sounds were that of Theon's cries and his sister's panicked breaths. "What, Jon?" The king growled, sword still held above his head, ready to descend and cut through the boy's neck. "They are children. Innocent of their father's crimes. They are Greyjoys." The cold and unforgiving fury that had taken over Ned's mind had disappeared at the sight of the cowering children. The boy was barely 10 and the girl couldn't be more than 13, and he stepped forward. However reluctantly, he had to acknowledge that killing these two would be no better than killing the Targaryen children. Despite his hatred for the Greyjoys, he was no hypocrite, and he was no child killer. "Jon is right, Robert," he said lowly. "The children are innocent in this. Spare them." Everyone waited with bated breath to see what the king would do. His hesitation was obvious. The tightening of his jaw and the whitening of his knuckle around the Kingslayer's sword announced to all what he wanted to do, but Ned Stark and Jon Arryn had been reigning in the Baratheon's worst impulses since he was a child, and Ned knew that Robert would allow cooler heads to prevail. The sword was thrown to the ground with a loud clatter and the Northerner allowed himself a sigh. Of relief or of disappointment, he didn't know, but it was the right thing to do. Turning his blood-drenched face to the last remaining Greyjoys, the king scowled down at them. "You will not die today," he announced. "But you will not remain at Pike, and the day you step out of line is the day I will end your line." Raising his voice, Robert called out to all in the room. "House Greyjoy is no more. Even with the survival of these two, a Kraken will never again rule over the Iron Islands. Put them in a cell and have them guarded at all times until we decide what to do with them." And with that, he stormed out of the hall, leaving the rest of his lords behind. The rebellion was over, the Greyjoys deposed and the fighting done. Now came the real work. 3 days had passed since the death of Balon Greyjoy, and while the majority of the army had been sent back to the mainland, the lords and officers were unfortunately still holed up on Pike. The Red Wine and Royal fleets had done as commanded and protected the rest of the country, defeating the Iron Fleet before rejoining the Northern Fleet at Pike, and now the Lords Paramount and the King sat in a dusty and dark room, discussing the future of the Iron Islands now that their ruling house had been deposed as per the royal decree that Robert had written up. "I don't like that there's still an heir alive," the king grumbled. Ned and Jon sighed, and he could tell that if Tywin allowed himself to show even a speck of emotion he would be sighing too. Truth be told, Robert didn't even know why he was arguing anymore. They'd been over it dozens of times in the last few days and the arguments stayed the same. They were children, they were innocent, they were easily controlled, his decree made it impossible for them to reclaim their seat, blah blah blah. But still, he was the king. He should be able to do what he wanted. Only the memory of his row with his brother in all but blood stopped him from telling them all to fuck off and killing the Kraken cubs. Pups. Hatchlings. Whatever. The point was, he had never seen Ned in such a rage before and never wanted to do so again. For a moment when they had been fighting all those years ago, he thought it was over between them. And then he had gone to see Ned before he set off to find Lyanna and they had talked, and though there was still anger at what the Northerner called injustice, the man had calmed down and told him that what was done was done. He knew better than to make the same mistake again. The children would live and be watched for the entirety of their lives. "Robert," Jon began, but the king waved a hand to cut him off. I know, it's not honorable or whatever. So what do we do with them now? We could keep them as wards of the throne." His hand suggested, looking around the table to see what the other lords thought of the idea. Some like Tyrell and Lannister seemed in favor of the idea, but it was Ned's opinion Robert wanted the most. Yet when he looked at the man, he was almost impossible to read, the grimness of his face giving nothing away. He was almost as bad as that Dornish fucker who just sat there with a smirk. "All right," he sighed. "Who'll take them?" "I would be happy to take the boy, Your Grace," Tywin offered, and Robert was immediately against the idea. The man had a gleam in his eyes, and truth be told, father by law or not, he didn't trust the old lion as far as he could throw him. Maybe because he was his father by law. Any man who raised such a bitch of a woman as his wife was no good, not to mention the lion's more than bloody reputation. Might as well kill the boy now and have it done with. The boy can go to the wall. Heads turned towards Ned, who had leaned forward in his seat. If anything, he had grown grimmer in all their years apart. His Tully wife must not be comforting him enough for him to be so dour. Or maybe she was comforting him too much and now he felt her loss. Regardless, the man was giving Stannis a run for his money in sheer grimness, though Robert did admit that the situation did call for it. There was nothing more dull than sitting in a chair all day talking about the future. The wall. He quite liked the idea. The Theon boy would give up his name and be stuck on the edge of the world, buried under snow for the rest of his life. There would be no danger of him trying to reclaim his father's seat, no talk of him in the realm ever again. Looking around the table, Robert saw that the lords were even more in favor of this idea than they were of keeping him as a ward to the throne and taking them back to one of their seats, all except Tywin at least, and that was enough to convince him. Even if the idea had been shit, the thought of pissing off the old lion was worth it. Robert nodded. And what of the girl? Jon asked, and more than a few in the room sighed. The girl. She was a feisty one, that was for sure. She had already killed 2 guards and injured another while trying to escape and had had to be removed from her cushy rooms and taken down to the cells under the keep. While Theon was silent and obedient, Asha Greyjoy screamed insults, inventive insults that had made Robert laugh when he heard of them, whenever she saw or heard a guard come close. She would be more difficult to keep contained, and if she had been a boy, she would have been the one to watch. I want her far away from any coast, watched by someone that knows how to handle her. Robert said. I would be happy to take her as my ward, Your Grace. Mace Tyrell offered, leaning forward with a dopey smile on his face. Robert scoffed. As if he would trust the Tyrells to keep the girl cowed. He wouldn't trust them to wipe his ass after their siege of Storm's End, where his younger brothers had starved for over a year. Your flowery knights wouldn't know how to keep a lid on that girl if they tried, Mace. She'll gut her way through the entire Reach. Ned, what about you? The king responded. Winterfell is far inland and I know you northerners can keep her tamed. And who knows, even the cold might be enough to shut her up. His brother in all but blood's jaw tightened and Robert suppressed a wince. His king had requested it so Ned would accept, but he wasn't happy about it. Robert would have to make it up to him somehow. Maybe a spot on the small council. No, making him come south wouldn't be a favor, despite how he wished he had his brother beside him. As you wish, Your Grace. Good, then that's sorted. What's next? The lordship of the Iron Islands still needs to be decided, Your Grace. Jon responded and Robert suppressed another sigh. He wanted out of this pile of shit rocks and to somewhere the hose didn't smell like fucking fish. All right. Do we have any candidates? Tywin's face didn't budge, didn't twitch, and yet Robert knew what he would say as soon as he finished talking. Perhaps it would be best for the Iron Islands to be absorbed by one of us here, rather than appointing a new Lord Paramount. The blonde fuck said. A way to completely incorporate them into the 7 kingdoms in more than just name and get rid of their blasted old way. They will be cowed and ruled by someone strong enough to keep them to heel. Someone like Tywin, he meant. Robert would rather smash his own head against his hammer than give the bastard more territory. And which one of us would take over the Iron Islands? Ned asked, narrowing his eyes at the Lannister. Who here knows anything about ruling a barren wasteland of rocks? There are no mines here for you, Lord Lannister, nor fields of crops for Lord Tyrell and Lord Tully. I know I for one feel completely unqualified to take over this place despite the North being one of the most difficult lands to manage profitably. Not to mention the people will never follow a Greenlander as they call us. Jon added. Ned was completely right. The Iron Islands were a bunch of useless rocks that were worth less than his royal shits. No greenery, no fields, nothing worthwhile in the ground at all except a few veins of iron, and a population that was dirty, uneducated and savage. Probably the only person here that would be able to do anything with it would be Stannis, considering how Dragonstone wasn't all that different, but Jon raised a good point. Any one of them that thought to take over the Iron Islands would find themselves murdered within a year. This was going to be a long day. If I may, and Robert almost groaned at the sound of the Red Viper's voice. I believe I have a solution. Well, Martel. The infuriating cunt smirked at him, his face a picture of superiority and smugness that made him want to smash the man's head on the table. See how he looked with a broken nose and teeth. Lord Arryn is correct that the populace will only follow a fellow Iron Islander. The Dornish prince said. As it so happens, I know of one Ironborn lord who agreed with and thrived under Quayen's banning of the old way. And who would that be? Roderick Harlaw. Oberyn responded. I know him from my time at the Citadel, believe it or not, and given the chance, he would return to the days of Quayen and outlaw any reaving and raiding. I believe he is currently in the cells below along with his niece. It was an idea, a good one at that. Better than Tywin's at the very least. Harlaw. Known far and wide as the reader for his love of books and sciences. Proficient in the old way, but it was well known he took no joy in it. Anyone else have any ideas? The lords looked to those around them, but no one spoke up, so Robert turned to Sir Barristan behind him. Have Harlaw brought up. I'll speak with him before I make a decision. With a nod and a short bow, the old knight strode off, leaving the lords in the room alone. Not much was said, not much was done. Robert drank his wine and they all stayed silent, sat in their chairs just waiting for the Kingsguard to come back with the prisoner and potential future Lord Paramount. It would take years, decades, for the Iron Islands to settle under a mainlander lord. That was time Robert would have to spend watching his back, keeping his eye out at sea in case the Ironborn rose in rebellion again. No, raising an already established major house to a great house would be the best bet, the easiest and quickest way to ensure peace and safety, and House Harlaw was probably their best option. A lord who looked down on the old way and probably raised his sons similarly, an educated man that had studied at the Citadel, a man who was known and at least slightly respected, only slightly due to his moniker of reader, but respected all the same, by the other houses and their small folk. Hopefully a man he could work with. Unfortunately, Robert had never really paid attention to his lessons. He listened to whatever interested him and ignored the rest. Due to his friendship with Ned and his love for Lyanna, the king knew almost all there was to know about the North, and due to his loyalty to his homeland he had always been invested in the affairs of the Stormlands. But the Iron Islands was the one place that he knew perhaps the least about, and that was going to complicate things. If he remembered his lessons correctly, and that was a big if, then Quayen's attempts at spurning the old way failed for a multitude of reasons. First and most obviously, he died before he could actually make any meaningful progress and left a savage of a son behind. But there was also something niggling at the back of his mind, trade. No one would trade with them. Before he could dig further into the recesses of his wine-rotted brain, Sir Barristan reappeared with the prisoner behind him. Roderick Harlaw limped into the room with his head held high despite the fact that he hadn't bathed since the siege, smelled like he had lived with the pigs his entire life and looked like he had been dipped in a tub of blood. Harlaw. Robert grunted. Sit. The man did as ordered and took a seat on the other end of the table with a clink of his chains, next to Mace Tyrell, who wrinkled his nose and tried to discreetly shift his chair further away. Now. We find ourselves in a conundrum, reader. He began. The Greyjoys are dead and deposed, and your youngest niece and nephew will be heading north. One to Winterfell and the other to the Wall. And now we find ourselves in need of a ruler of this shit-stained pack of islands you call a home. The Ironborn will never follow a Greenlander. I know that, dipshit. I want someone who can hold the islands, get rid of your damned old ways and not get murdered while doing it. You, reader, have been recommended for the position. Eyes widening comically, Harlaw seemed to choke on air for a moment. The room waited in silence as the man pulled himself together, mouth bobbing open like a fish out of water and head swiveling around him as if to double-check with the others that Robert was being serious. Me, your grace. Yes, you. I'm, your grace. Yes, yes. You're thankful and whatever bullshit. Robert sighed, leaning forward in his seat to pin the would-be Lord Paramount with his stare. I'm not convinced it's a good choice, Harlaw. So convince me. I'm told you preferred the days under Quayen more than you did those under his son. Is this true? Yes, your grace. I'm good at reaving, but it's an outdated practice. I preferred my time at the Citadel. Yes, The Viper told us all about your time at the Citadel. What about your son, does he deny the old ways like you?
He does, Your Grace.
And how old is he?
Nearing 15, Your Grace, and my youngest is 7.
Robert nodded and sat back in his seat, eyeing Roderick closely. This will do well. A learned man native to the country who had 2 sons of the same ideology as him. House Harlaw will be elevated to Lord Paramount of the Iron Islands, the king announced. Around him a few of the lords nodded in agreement while the reader himself smiled slightly. Your heir will marry a daughter of a mainlander house, I don't care which one, but I want the betrothal announced within the year. Sitting straighter than he had been when he first walked in, the new Lord of the Iron Islands nodded once, accepting the king's terms. Robert was about to announce the end of it when Tywin Bloody Lannister leaned forward. The only item left is to ensure that this peace and the outlawing of the old ways remains in place, he said, and Robert remembered his musings from before Sir Barristan had returned. Quayan Greyjoy had much the same ambitions as us, and he failed. That can't happen again. Lord Harlaw, you're the one with most knowledge regarding your lands, so give us ideas.
Trade, Your Grace.
The reader responded immediately. Quayan failed because he couldn't make trade agreements. We have fields, we have forests, we have fishing villages, but nowhere near in enough quantity to support the entirety of the islands. That's why the old way has been our way for so long. Most of our coin, food and wood comes from whatever lands we pillage. Then let's talk trade, Roderick. Oberyn responded, leaning back in his chair slowly as he swirled his wine. What followed was the longest and dullest talks of Robert's life. If this had been King's Landing, he would have gone off to find some whore within minutes. Alas, this was not King's Landing, and the whores here were of such quality that he'd actually prefer sitting here and talking all day. Truthfully, most of what Harlaw was saying was quite educational. Turns out the Iron Islands weren't a massive waste of space. They of course had their iron mines on Great Wyk, but they also had numerous small copse of trees on Old Wyk and Harlaw which produced good quality wood, a type of mountain goat that was found all over the place and was native to the islands that produced a gamey meat and a strong cheese according to the reader, and their crabs were supposedly the best there was. Then the trading agreements were hashed out. The Viper agreed to exchange exotic fruits such as bananas and figs for some yellow mustard, some sort of spice, and mountain goldenrod which could be used in certain medicines. Tully and Tyrell promised food in exchange of 3 ships to go to Seaguard, and a regular shipment of mountain goat cheese and iron for Riverrun, while Highgarden got iron, yellow mustard and crab meat. Ned traded timber for crab meat and goat cheese, and even Lannister would pay for iron and a small population of mountain goats that he would let roam on the cliffs of Casterly Rock. Overall, several profitable ventures were agreed, though the reader begged a year of allowance for him to set up a proper industry to meet the demand for the cheese. It needed to age properly after all, and they were no longer only producing it for themselves. The Iron Islands would never be rich, but with these new agreements they would be able to live comfortably without raiding the riches of others. Finally, all the talking and decision-making was done, and nothing was keeping them on the Iron Islands anymore. Harlaw would be left to handle the other lords of the islands and deal with the aftermath of the rebellion, and Robert would send out his decree to all the houses of the kingdom. Let's get fucking going, Robert bellowed, barely able to keep his eagerness in check as his chair toppled over. I'm not spending another moment on this fucking rock. Let's get back to the mainland so I can find myself a proper fucking whore. Chapter 12. The sight of his home on the horizon was enough to loosen Ned Stark's shoulders and make him sigh in relief, much like it did almost 7 years ago. This time, however, he marched at the head of a much larger host. The lords that lived north of Winterfell, the likes of Umber, Karstark and Mormont, had travelled home with the navy, taking the much quicker route via sea to White Harbour, while the others accompanied the Stark host on foot, each of them splitting off as they neared their home. That didn't mean that Stark was alone with his soldiers and men-at-arms now that Winterfell was within sight, though, far from it. At his side rode Willers Tyrell, now a boy of 13 on his way to be fostered. He was inquisitive and joyful, and though Highgarden was grander and more eye-catching than anything in the north, the lad had hardly closed his mouth since they passed the neck. Every new thing he saw provoked a smile and a slew of questions, and with all the improvements made over the past half-decade, Willers was constantly entertained. The number of new villages and farms they passed had the boy cursing the outdated maps of the south, and each castle they stopped at had him questioning the lords about the renovations and extensions they had made. Behind them, watched carefully by a dozen soldiers, was a cart that contained the tied-up form of Asher Greyjoy. After 3 escape attempts during which a total of 4 men and 3 horses died before they even reached the twins, Ned had ordered her bound and gagged. At first she had refused any food offered to her, but quickly came to the conclusion that she was just crippling herself. Still, she had to be hand-fed to avoid emptying her, and the guard that fed her had to be wary lest she try and bite his fingers off. He had no idea what he would do with the girl. It had already been 2 months since Pike had been taken, and yet she fought every day. He would have to keep a firm hand on her, more firm than he would normally be comfortable with. At the very back of the procession, behind the 2,000 Stark soldiers and levies, were dozens of cages pulled by mules. Each one contained 12 men, bound for the wall. A gift to make up for the pain that was the Ironborn girl he was to keep for an undetermined amount of time. Before the invasion of the Iron Islands, the king, on Ned and Jon Arryn's recommendation, had sent out an order that the small folk were not to be touched. Even Robert had to agree that the sack of King's Landing was a travesty and not one that should ever be repeated. The majority of the Crown's armies had followed the orders of their liege, though for many it was reluctant, Ned was sure, but those men following the Northern Army home had ignored them. 408 rapists, murderers and thieves who thought they could take advantage of the chaos of war to hide their misdeeds, and so were to take the black and live out their days at the edge of the world. Is that Wintertown, Lord Stark? Turning his attention to the outline of a settlement that Willers was pointing to, Ned didn't bother suppressing his smile. On the eastern side of the King's Road, Wintertown was large and surrounded by tall walls, though some of the buildings were tall enough to be seen over them. Aye, it is. Is it true that the town is mostly empty during summer, only to be inhabited during the colder winter years? It was. Lord Stark responded. But that is no longer the case since the end of Robert's rebellion. Wintertown is now the permanent home of many families, those that were called upon to aid us in our attempts at improving the land. Within those walls live some of the best architects, builders, cartographers and prospectors in the world. Wintertown is no longer the empty place it used to be, though of course there is still more than enough room for any small folk that seeks warmth. Willers let out a breath of wonder and almost unconsciously spurred his horse to go faster. So many learned men. The Reach is also quite the attraction, Lord Willers. I imagine meeting men with a wide array of experiences is the norm for you. Willers, please Lord Stark. The boy replied. And you are correct, I suppose. Though most of the traders only stop in Old Town before they leave. Really the only people of note that visit Highgarden are of the artistic type. You know, painters, sculptors, bards and the like. And when I was hosted at your home when you were younger, I listened to the best music during our feasts and sat by the most beautiful statues and fountains in your gardens. The blonde smiled softly and nodded at the older man, puffing his chest up in pride. That's right, Lord Stark. He said. Highgarden is indeed the most beautiful there is in the 7 kingdoms. But still, I look forward to seeing what life is like in the north. I heard northerners placed more stock in practicality than beauty. Is that true, my lord? The Reachmen and northerners behind them didn't care to hide their chuckles, and Ned allowed himself an indulgent smile at the young lord's many questions. Did the north have bards? Did they have feasts? Did Lady Stark have silks and jewelry, or was that not considered practical? How did they use the hot springs under the castle to keep the walls warm? Could he visit Wintertown someday? Was it very busy at the moment since it was still winter here? How much longer would winter last? It was never ending, but Ned indulged him, happy that the young man was so enthusiastic at seeing the north. Not many in the south could say the same, considering it a frigid and wild land that was best avoided. Of course that didn't stop the small folk from flocking north when word spread that work was available. Lord Stark, what is that? The boy cried as they drew closer to the town. Opposite Wintertown, just on the other side of the King's Road, was a small hill that Ned could have sworn had never been there before. Upon closer inspection, he could see that the small hill was actually piles upon piles of timber and rock. The beginnings of construction. I don't know, Willers. Frowning at the sight, he tried to think back to any construction projects close to Winterfell, but came up short. Something of vengeance. As they drew closer, the men working around the construction materials stopped and waved, cheering just like the small folk in every other town they passed. Willers and many of the soldiers behind them returned their waves and smiles, but Ned just nodded and continued on. To Winterfell, to his family. To the child that had been born just over a month ago. His second daughter, whose birth he had missed, named Arya according to the letter Maester Luwin had sent to Moat Cailin. Horns sounded from the walls of Winterfell, a signal that their lord was approaching and to open the gates, and his heart fluttered at the thought of what awaited him behind them. A slight gasp from his right had Ned turning his attention to his new ward, glad for the distraction, and a smile appeared on his face. Winterfell was indeed a formidable castle, but the thick walls obstructed almost everything from view. Built for strength rather than aesthetic, the walls were thicker than anything seen in the south, and the buildings within had the young reachman gaping, his head swiveling from side to side. The guards and servants he had brought with him were not much better. As he pulled on the reins of his horse, his eyes went back to those waiting for him in the courtyard, all stood in a row before the great keep. His family. His wife, children and brother, the entire household were there, beaming with tears in their eyes. And even more importantly, the tiny bundle of cloth that his wife held in her arms. He didn't even remember dismounting. He didn't remember passing his horse off to the stable boy or the welcoming words the young man said to him. One moment he was atop his horse and the other he had his wife in his arms, his hand held her head close to his chest and his nose berries in her hair. Then he pulled back and peered down at the wrinkly little face of his daughter. Just like the first 3 times a babe had been placed in his arms, he stared on in awe. Speechless, he cupped his new daughter's face and a mad giggle escaped him. Her head could fit in the palm of his hand. And what a beautiful head it was, eyes grey as a storm, hair dark as night. A true Stark, both in name and in looks. She's beautiful, Cat. He breathed and his wife sighed contentedly next to him. Feeling the impatience of his other children, Ned placed a gentle kiss upon his daughter's head and passed her off to her mother before taking a knee. As soon as his arms opened, he found himself besieged by 3 cheering children and he laughed in delight, holding Rob, Sansa and Jon tightly to him, kissing their heads and whispering words of affection to them. Only once he had reunited with his family did he stand, his smile still very much present as he turned and gestured for Willers to come forward. Everyone, I'd like you to meet Willers Tyrell, come to foster with us for some years. I trust you to make him feel welcome and treat him as a member of our family while he is here. He said, meeting their eyes one by one as they nodded seriously. Willers, this is my family, my wife the Lady Catelyn, my brother Benjen, my children Rob, Sansa and Arya, and finally my nephew Jon. Welcome to Winterfell, Lord Willers. Catelyn greeted and the young man smiled in response. Thank you, Lady Catelyn, it's wonderful to be here and you have a truly beautiful home. I look forward to getting to know you all. The receiving smiles from the children led Ned to believe that all would be well. He was home, he was with his family, he had been blessed with the birth of a new Stark, and one of their secret allies had been welcomed into his home. Life would go on, peace would reign, and when the time came to break that peace arrived, the Starks, Tyrells and Martells would have bonds as strong as the one he and Robert had, would still have if not for the man's many mistakes. It was quiet in the Godswood. The rustling of the trees, the chirping of the birds and the rippling of the water behind him, Ned had missed this place. It had taken him almost a week after his return home before he found time to visit. First had come the settling of Willers and his party. Then he had reacquainted himself with his family, reveling in the laughs and frantic blabber of his children, his brother's gentle arm squeezes and the kisses of his wife. Lastly, he had holed himself up in his solo with his brother and wife while they went over all he had missed. He had to admit, Catelyn was truly inspired when she had come up with the idea of the Northern Games. The ice skating was also an ingenious prospect and he had visited both Winterfell's private rink near the first keep and the much larger one in Wintertown that was for the small folks' use, and he had been astounded at the amount of joyful people gliding across the ice on the peculiar shoes, or skates. But the Northern Games were another thing entirely. An ambitious venture, but with unlimited potential. A slew of different activities, all of which would attract considerable attention. An expensive venture, for sure, but one that could make up the cost tenfold. Born a lady of the South she may have been, but Caitlin Stark was now a true Northerner. Which is what had decided him. The snapping of a twig brought Ned out of his musings and he turned to see his wife approaching. He stood to greet her, kissing her cheek softly before she lowered herself onto the log that served as a bench. For a few more moments he was silent, aware of her questioning gaze. She was a Northerner through and through now, but still, he had to be sure. "Do you love me, Cat?" he asked. "Pardon?" Turning his head to look at her, he found her staring at him in bewilderment. "We were strangers when we wed. You were promised to my brother, not to me," he clarified. "But still, you have been mine as I have been yours for 7 years now. You have borne me 3 healthy children and accepted my nephew as your own, though he is not of your blood and a bastard at that. I like to think we have come far from the strangers that stood at the September in Riverrun, and I know that I have come to love you dearly along the years. Is the same true for you?" Caitlin's eyebrows were furrowed, her mouth opening and closing silently as she searched for words and her eyes flickered between his, searching his face for an explanation for this sudden interrogation. "Please," Ned continued when the silence became too much. "I beg you, respond truthfully. I will not be angry, I will not be upset if it is not the case. I need an honest." "Ned." His mouth snapped shut, forming a grim line as he awaited her answer. "You silly man," she scolded. "Of course I love you. I have for years. What is this sudden questioning?" Instead of answering her question, he asked more of his own, not allowing himself to feel relief just yet. "And you are loyal to me, above all others? Above the king? If I was to tell you, right now, that I plotted treason, would you forsake Robert and support me?" His tone was urgent, his face more serious than ever, and she took a moment to think over her response, her eyes never leaving his. "Family, duty, honor," she said. "Duty and honor would have me be loyal to the king before anyone, but family comes first. In my house's words and in my heart. I promise, Ned." Letting a deep breath out through his nose, he dropped his head to his chest and closed his eyes. Just like when he had revealed the truth to the Martells, he told himself he could still turn back. He could just thank her for her love and walk away, but he wouldn't. He needed help. Not just from Benjen, not regarding the alliance or the betterment of the North, but regarding John himself, G. Harries. It was agreed that as soon as the boy could understand the concept of a secret, he would be told of his true identity. But when? How could he possibly judge that for certain? If he got it wrong it was all of their heads, it was his promise to Lyanna evaporating in the wind. And how could he be solely responsible for raising 2 future kings? He needed support. He needed his wife. "What we know of Robert's rebellion is a lie," he announced finally, his voice so soft it could have been lost in the rustling of the leaves. "Of course, the rebellion only really began when the Mad King killed Brandon and my father, but it was Rhaegar taking Lyanna that put the events in motion." He felt like a maester, lecturing his charges in the history of the 7 kingdoms. Caitlin didn't speak, she didn't interrupt, but he could tell that her confusion had increased tenfold. "That was a lie," Ned repeated. "He didn't steal my sister. She went willingly. They married." There was silence, only broken by his wife's sharp inhale. Kat's eyes had widened and she had covered her mouth with her hand in shock. "But that means, but why?" He shrugged, suddenly listless at the memory of the tragedies that had befallen his family. "She saw what I could not see," he said. "My brother in all but blood. Jovial, loud, passionate, strong. Robert was a man I thought everyone should look up to, despite our differences in personality. Someone who I thought anyone would be happy to bask in the presence of." Lyanna, on the other hand, saw how he had dishonored a maid and left her to bear the consequences alone, with John Arryn having to provide money to support the child in Robert's stead. She saw how quick he was to anger, how easily insulted he was, and how to insult him was practically a death sentence. She saw what I was blind to. The memories of his time in the Vale came back to him, danced before his eyes as if to taunt him. Every time he moped in his rooms only for Robert to come and cheer him up. Every woman, highborn or low, swooning after just a few honeyed words. Every man clapping him on the back after a spar. Every servant that flinched in fear when he found that his meat was not cooked to his liking. Every man that escorted their sisters and daughters wherever they went. Pepper, hidden behind a closed door as the midwives helped her through her birth, screaming Robert's name while Ned paced the corridor anxiously, wondering why his friend was not here to see his daughter come into the world. So she fled. There was appalled accusation in Caitlyn's voice. The pitch and volume had risen, and Ned mused that he shouldn't be so surprised that a dutiful woman like her would be aghast at his sister's actions. After all, Caitlyn had been betrothed to Brandon before him, and his older brother was like Robert in many ways. Caitlyn wouldn't have had a very happy marriage with him, and it was entirely possible her marriage with Ned would turn out badly for all she knew, but she was a Tully and she would do her duty as her father demanded of her. I can't blame her. Ned responded, turning to look his wife in the eye. Regardless of duty, regardless of honored promises, I can't blame her. This was to be her whole life. She was just 15, with decades longer to live. I can't blame her for running from fate when it seemed devoid of happiness. And yet there was anger within him, aimed at his sister, that he had tried to ignore for 7 whole years. Because she was his sister, because she had been just a child, because she was dead. In a flash, the quiet wolf was standing. He turned, a scowl on his face and kicked the makeshift bench where he had been sitting, making his wife jump back in fright. Fuck. God's fucking damn. She didn't even leave a fucking letter. She didn't think. She just fucking left with barely a plan, if any at all. And she didn't even take a God's damned maester with her. Ned. They didn't have a maester, Cat. He whimpered, and his wife was suddenly before him, clutching him close to her, pushing his head into the crook of her neck, whispering reassurances, and he realized that for the first time since he found his beloved Lionel on that bed of blood and roses, he was crying. Sobbing, actually. Loudly, violently hiccuping and shaking in his wife's arms. And he left her there. He left her to fight in a war, alone with only the King's Guard as company, and no maester. His wife's fingers were curled tightly into his hair as she held him in place, his shaking sobs making her own body tremble. And I didn't think. None of us thought, if any of us had just thought to take a God's damned maester, she could still be alive, she could still be here to see her boy. He would have a mother, he'd have everything he could want. Ned. Caitlyn was in front of him now, holding his face in her hands and staring intently into his eyes. She waited a moment for his sobs to quieten, his shakes to calm, and only when his tears were silently falling down his face did she speak, softly, like she would to one of the boys when soothing a hurt. The thought almost made him smile. Ned, you're not making any sense. She said. I thought you only arrived minutes before her death. Even the most educated of healers cannot stop death when it is already here, my love. There is nothing you could have done. But he could have. He should have. The man responded hoarsely. His eyes were fixed on hers but he was unseeing, stuck in the past, picturing his sister on that bed of blood. Who, Rhaegar? Caitlyn asked, still in that same reassuring voice. How could he have known she would catch a fever? Everyone knows, Cat. They say the birthing chamber is the woman's battlefield. He should have known to have a healer on hand as soon as he learnt of her condition. It was with a gasp that the lady took a step back, taking her hands from her husband's face to cover her own mouth. They stared at each other in silence as she read the truth on her husband's heartbroken face. Lionel had broken her betrothal. She had run away with the prince. They had married. And she had given the heir to the throne a legitimate child. There was no denying this. The rebellion was a lie. The child. She finally whispered, hope as clear on her face as the shock was. What she hoped for, Ned didn't know. Perhaps an end to this tragic tale with the death of the babe. Perhaps news that Lyanna had born a girl. That Ned had sent the child away with the other baby Targaryens to Essos. He could give her nothing but the truth. G. Harry's. Named John until the time is right. John. And with that came the realization. John was his nephew, their nephew, but not by Brandon. They had the only living son of the former heir to the throne under their roof. As kin. A boy born with the title of king as soon as he came out of the womb. A royal child wearing the face of a bastard in order to survive. Caitlin fell back onto the log they had previously been sat on, hands still covering her mouth and eyes staring at the ground as the thoughts ran wild in her head, and Ned joined her slowly, keeping a wary eye on her face expression. You said until the time is right. His wife whispered, slowly bringing her eyes up to meet his. What do you mean? Until the time is right for what? The doorman winced. No matter how many times he admitted to his treason, it never got easier. He averted his gaze as he spoke. There is a plot. He confessed. Robert is, I never saw it, but Robert is a cruel man. He relished in the humiliation and deaths of Princess Elia and her royal children. Spat on the floor and called them dragon spawn. He is an even worse king. He thinks of nothing but fighting, feasting and whoring. And in truth, I confess that after the last king took too many liberties with my family, I am unwilling to subject my people to a southern king ever again. Especially this one. What are you saying, Ned? Finally, the man looked up to meet his wife's eyes. I'm saying that the North will be independent once more, like in the times before the conquest. Rob will not be a lord, he will be a king. He announced. And at the request of the North's allies, I will also aid in ridding the South of Robert. Rob will rule the North while John G. Harris rules the rest of West Eos. Caitlin seemed to slump, even as her eyes closed and she took a deep breath. Ned waited what seemed an eternity, but when they reopened, his wife's eyes were hard, focused. Determined. What do you need me to do? Chapter 13. Politics was a woman's job in Olena's not-so-humble opinion. Oh sure, it was the men who ruled, who took care of the petitions and the alliances and the financing of the state, but politicking, the art of calculating the future, of manipulating it to best suit one's purposes, that was best left to the women. If she was to be completely fair, Olenna had to admit that every once in a while the likes of Tywin Lannister and Doran Martell appeared, true players of the game, the both of them, but the majority of the men she had met in her long life were closer to the likes of Robert Baratheon, Mace Tyrell, her own son, oh how the disappointment still hurt, and Ned Stark. One was completely blind to the whole idea of politics, thinking only in the present, the other seemed to have completely ignored all of her lessons, and though he tried, the gods knew Mace looked in the right places with the right intentions and yet somehow always came up with the wrong conclusion, and the last. Well. Ned had surprised her, she had to confess. She, like all Southerners she was sure, had considered the North as completely barbaric, completely incapable of critical thought, and completely unaware of the great game that they all played south of the neck. The Lord Stark was a pleasant lesson that one could not become too consumed by hubris and arrogance lest they be blinded to others' brilliance. Truly, Ned was a diamond in the rough being the main point here. The man had been dissatisfied, chosen his preferred solution and then worked to gain allies to make it become a reality. What he failed to understand was that details were the be-all and end-all of any plan. One couldn't just make a to-do list and call it a day. No. For a plan to work, for traitors to not have their heads chopped off, thank you very much, one needed to know the hows, the whats, the wheres and the whens. One needed the what-ifs and the plans B and C, all the way through to Q. In the years since Lord Stark had first come to them, Olenna had been hard at work. It wasn't enough to have allies, one needed to ensure the links between each faction were so tight and so many, they may as well resemble chainmail. Figuratively speaking, of course. A compliment here and a suggestion there to her kin, and suddenly Myra Forrester was to become a handmaiden to Margaery, Lioness Hightower had wed Jorah Mormont at the tourney of Lannisport, Romilda Redwyne was betrothed to Naran Manwadi and Gullen, Jonelle Hightower and Asta Redwyne were to foster at Sunspear, Blackmont and White Harbour respectively. Of course her kin were not the only that were given advice that would benefit them in the future. After a quick word to one of her granddaughter's handmaidens, one of the Fossoway cousins negotiated a squiring position for his son with some Dornish knight, and Highgarden's master-at-arms had recommended to his brother Lord Peake that he send his second son to squire for Sir Helman Tallheart. The Reach, the North and Dorne were now irreversibly tied. All this was beyond the Stark's capabilities, so although he had impressed her, although he may not be as bad as she had expected at the game of secrecy and conquest, Olenna could hardly let him be the only one coming up with their treasonous plots. So it was with great pleasure that she received a letter from Catelyn Stark requesting to begin a correspondence regarding potential future endeavors between the Starks and Tyrells. Catelyn was hardly on the level of Olenna herself when it came to doublespeak and secrecy, but she was competent enough, more competent than her husband, that was certain. For over a year, letters were exchanged, ideas discussed and plans modified, and now Olenna was finally going to get the chance to see the Starks, the linchpin of their operation, in full, the lady that had so delighted the aging Reachwoman with her not quite refined ingenuity, as well as the children that the entire thing depended upon. These northern games were another reason Catelyn Stark was impressive. A land of people widely viewed as savage and uncultured for their lack of anything remotely fun, their obsession over winter and storing food and saving money, ugh. It was all such a bore. But Catelyn had found the one thing that could endear the South more to her new homeland while working within the Northerners' tastes. Not just the Northerners in fact, but all of the Seven Kingdoms were interested in this new Northern entertainment, and some were even making the long trek from their own lands to attend the very first Northern Games in history. All the Northern houses would be attending of course, as well as some of the Tullys, most likely only Edmure and Brynden the Blackfish, as Olenna had heard Lord Hoster's health had been ailing recently. Besides, it wouldn't do to leave the seat of a great house completely unattended, and a few houses from the Vale, the Redforts and the Royces being the most prominent. Olenna had even heard that Tywin had sent his second son to investigate and gather information, and then of course there was Olenna herself along Margaery and Loras, as well as a contingent from Dorne that Garland would be accompanying as he was fostering with the Martells. At last, all of her grandchildren in the same place. The old woman allowed herself a small smile at the thought. More importantly, all parties of the alliance would be in one place. Who knew what could be accomplished when they didn't have to rely on ravens and the old tongue to communicate? Though it seemed Stark had accomplished much of his own goals. Margaery had absolutely squealed when they came within sight of Moat Cailin, her and her brother rushing to the window of their carriage to get a better look. Olenna had almost had a heart attack when Loras had leaned out too far and almost fallen, only to be caught by one of the guards and pushed back inside. He had then gone on a long rant and lecture about how Moat Cailin had once been almost untouchable when it was whole, how it guarded the neck from intruders trying to invade the north, and how the castle was credited as one of the main reasons the Faith of the Seven had never made it far north. His sister had slapped his shoulder and told him to stop telling them things they already knew and instead look at those pulley systems. Olenna loved her grandchildren, truly. They weren't entirely wrong in their excitement, she thought. Even her old heart had accelerated a time or two as they passed by the fortress and traveled along the King's Road through previously non-existent villages and farms, and she may have had to hold back a gasp at the sight of Castle Sewin when they stopped one night, reportedly only a small holdfast but now truly a sight to behold. Tall granite walls, a long line of guards placed along the road to welcome them, a glass garden the size of an entire field and a fountain in the main courtyard. Nothing like the derelict wooden shacks or austere plain stone keep she had expected. It was strange to think she was aware of the sudden wealth of the north. She was aware that all the money these houses were earning through trade was being funneled into expanding their farms and glass houses and increasing their defenses and the strength of their holdfasts, and yet she still expected to find crumbling stone, small wooden houses, lords bedecked in poor quality wool like common peasants. Seeing was believing, she supposed. She would have to ensure a maester or two were sent to update the maps of the citadel, because such inaccuracy simply wouldn't do. When it was time to make their move, Olenna didn't want anyone thinking the north was a backwater little country filled with huts in the mud. They needed to be seen as formidable as the south was, or the split of the Seven Kingdoms would not last more than 2 generations. The Northern Games would be the first step towards that purpose, she presumed. Not only would these games showcase the skills of the Northerners, but it would also bring any who wished to watch or participate to Winterfell, and what a sight that was. Out of all she had seen so far of the north, and granted it wasn't much considering they had stuck to the King's Road and any nearby keeps, Winterfell was by far the most impressive. Though perhaps Moat Cailin came close. A castle the size of an entire town, 2 thick and tall walls with a moat and drawbridge between them, hundreds of guards patrolling the top of each wall. It was completely impenetrable. It wasn't a great beauty, but perhaps that was only her own biased opinion. It was difficult to find any castle beautiful when one lived at Highgarden. After all, none could compare to the grace and enchantment that was the seat of the Tyrells. Still, it was far from the boring and austere grey keep she had expected. She should perhaps put her expectations to the side to avoid having her preconceptions repeatedly demolished. It was indeed made of light grey rock, with green lichen climbing up the walls a third of the way, the white and grey banners of the wolf tastefully decorating the guard towers and a visible burning brazier in each one. It was her understanding that barring a few repairs here and there on some barely used towers and the interior decorating, the castle hadn't been changed by the sudden influx of gold, meaning it had been this impressive even back before the rebellion, when the Starks were as poor as a great house could be. Tut. The state of Southern education. She really must send a letter to the Citadel in the near future, have them update their teachings on Northern affairs. The Starry September 2, demand they stop spreading word of savage Northerners sleeping on hay and feasting on blood. Thankfully, she had the precognition to request a maester that had lived his former life in the North to teach her grandchildren. Best their education prepare them for their future after all, especially little Margaery. Speaking of children, Olenna called, and twin heads of honey-brown hair swiveled towards her. We will soon be arriving at Winterfell, where the Starks shall be awaiting us, she said, leaning forward to ensure she had their attention. It is of the utmost importance that you conduct yourselves admirably, do you understand? Yes, grandmother. Good. A sharp nod and a tap of the cane showed the old woman's satisfaction. Normally she would trust in her education of the children, trust that they knew how to comport themselves and wouldn't bother stating the obvious. But this was important. You remember what I asked of you before we left? We need to make friends with the Starks. Loras recited, his hands clasped cutely at his front. Because it's important to the trade alliance that we continue our good relationship even through the next generation. Margaery continued, quoting Olenna almost word for word. That's right. The elderly woman nodded. The Starks are important. They are friends to the king and have grown in power since the rebellion, as you learned in your lessons. We must foster close relationships with them all, especially the children. Do you think Sansa will want to sew with me? Her sweet granddaughter asked, eyes wide and pleading. Olenna allowed herself a soothing smile. Of course, my dearest heart. The Lady Catelyn tells me little Sansa very much enjoys the womanly arts, though she is a little younger than you. That's all right, I can teach her anything she doesn't know yet. And I can spar with Lord Robb. I'm almost his age, I can keep up. Loras interjected, jumping slightly in his excitement and making the carriage rock uncomfortably. And little Jon too, remember. But isn't Jon a bastard? Loras. Margaery gasped, a hand coming to cover her mouth. What? He is a bastard. That's enough from you, young man. Olenna interrupted, knowing that if she let this continue it would end with the girl slapping her brother and them both turning away from each other to hide their tears. Not to mention the horror of Loras calling the future king of the Seven Kingdoms a bastard to his face. 'Tis true, Jon is a bastard. She ignored Lora's smug smile at his sister and pinned him with a hard glare. He is however Lord Stark's beloved nephew, Lord Robb's only cousin so far and the only child of Robb's age within the vicinity. The two have been raised as brothers, are reportedly never without one another, therefore Loras there will be no mention of Lord Jon's birth status. He is to be treated with the same respect as the rest of his family, is this understood? Yes, grandmother. The child's lowered head and sheepish foot shuffling didn't pull at Olenna's heart. It didn't. Good. Besides, you've both received the same letters from Willers as I, and you know your brother is fond of the boy, claims he is smart and polite, with the grace and dignity of any high-born child his age. I'm sure you will find a good friend in him, my dear. Another reason the planning should be done by the women, she thought. Oh, there was no other option than to have the boy pass as Brandon's bastard boy, but to have a supposed bastard foster with not one but two great families when he reached the right age. Impossible. Simply not done. The king would simply have to come south under the guise of squiring, or one of his cousins could foster with the Tyrells and Martells and the boy could simply accompany them. Image was important. Image was how they pulled this whole thing off without Tywin or Varys finding out. Regardless, Winterfell was in view, they would be within her walls within the hour, and as soon as she had a moment alone with Ned and Catelyn, they were going to go over this whole plan again and again until she was satisfied. Winterfell had never been so full. With Aunt Caitlin's new Northern Games beginning in less than a week, it seemed the whole of the North, nay, the entire country had gathered at the seat of the Starks to watch. And indeed, there were people from all over the kingdoms, not just the North. It was an endless cycle of introductions and politeness. First came the Tullys, Aunt Caitlin's brother and uncle. John didn't like Lord Edmure all that much, the young man, still a boy really, sneering a little and pursing his lips when he greeted John, despite showing affection to all the others. He didn't let it bother him. Aunt Caitlin had explained how Southerners viewed bastards, and if Edmure didn't want to hang around John, then he didn't want to hang around Edmure. Sir Bryndon was way more interesting anyway. He ruffled John's hair just like he did to Rob and promised them he'd tell them stories about battles. A few days after them came Tyrion Lannister, accompanied by 100 guards and a dozen servants, along with Lionel Lefford and Harold Westerling. Lord Lionel was by far the oldest, but even he was still young enough to not have any grey hairs, and Lord Tyrion had only recently come of age. Tyrion was also the only one that didn't look like he smelled something unpleasant when greeting the Starks, and John in particular, and from what John had seen at dinner the little man seemed quite funny, making his entire table roar with laughter. He and Rob had asked if they could go join them, but Aunt Caitlin had said they were too young. The Tyrells and the Martells arrived within a week of each other, and again, everyone had gathered in the courtyard and welcomed them, introduced themselves and made quick small talk. There were promises of spas, promises of lessons, promises of tours. Everyone was very busy. John and Rob suddenly found themselves entertaining half the heirs of the North, as well as sons of southern houses that they had barely begun learning about. Michael Redfort said his father was hoping to foster closer relations with the North by fostering a northern heir, and small Janumber, a boy 5 years their elder, kept making eyes at the older girls. He'd even started a conversation with Asha on one of the few occasions she left her rooms. Unfortunately for him, it ended with him on the ground holding a hand between his legs and the other against his bloody nose before he had even managed to finish his sentence. Oberyn Sand, one of Oberyn's daughters, had liked that. She had promptly swept the younger Greyjoy girl under her arm and led her away while laughing at the poor boy's plight. Margaery Tyrell had been nearby, and her shock and confusion at the scene had ended with the boys taking an entire afternoon to teach a few of the girls on where and how to hit a boy if he ever made rude and unwanted advances. It was an unexpected day, even more so when Loras laughed and winked at John after helping him recover from a hard blow from a Mormont girl, joking that they should run from the hills as none could escape the wrath of an offended lady. Lyra Mormont hit him in the face too for calling her a lady. John had never seen so many different people from so many different places, heard of so many different customs and ways of life. It was incredible, it was eye-opening, it was joyous. It was tiring. With all these visitors, with all the commotion of the games, John had barely any time for himself. Barely any time to think, to understand, to assimilate what his aunt and uncle had told him about his parentage and his future. He almost started crying when Lady Olenna apologized for not curtsying properly. He wasn't even 10 yet. No one should have to curtsy to him. He never even knew his father, had never even met a Targaryen at all, but everyone had to bow to him because he had fire in his blood. It made no sense. And yet, he may not be a man grown, not for a while yet, but he was no longer a child. He had Stark blood in his veins and had been raised by Starks, and he knew his duty and he knew he would accomplish it. If only he could just have a little silence to properly come to terms with it all though. Even as he sat at his desk, quill in hand, he flinched every time a ring of laughter sounded down the hallway despite the door being locked. He had already broken 2 quills from holding them too tight. Taking a deep breath to calm himself, John turned back to the blank piece of parchment before him and began to write his 4th attempt at a letter. To Prince Viserys and Princess Daenerys Targaryen. Hello. I have tried to write this letter a few times now, and I'm afraid I have so far been unsatisfied each time. I have learned many things recently about myself, my life and my family, and I hope you forgive the confused mess that this letter may turn out to be. I've decided that this will be my last attempt, that I will send it regardless of how idiotic it seems. So introductions first, I guess. My name is Jon Snow, or Jaehaerys Targaryen I suppose. Son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, your nephew. I hope you don't mind me writing in the old tongue, I was told your tutors had ensured you know it. I live with my mother's side of the family, in Winterfell, with my cousins Rob, Sansa, Arya and little baby Bran. I know you keep up to date with news from Westeros and that Prince Oberyn, who insists I call him uncle despite refusing to call me anything other than your grace when in private, visits every few years, so you must already be aware of all this, but since I know nothing of you, I thought it best I start from scratch. Are you happy where you are? Oberyn assures me you're taken care of, but I'd like to make sure myself. Not that I'd be able to do much about it, but I suppose I am the head of our house. If something was wrong, I could enlist the Starks to help. I know they would. I imagine that wherever you are receiving a proper Targaryen education, unlike me, although please do not worry. I am being taught to lead and rule, and of the history of our house, and Uncle Ned says that when I am older I will go to Highgarden and Sunspear to learn more about the South so that I may rule it properly. I'm not sure what else to include in this letter. Until we know more of each other, I suppose all I can do is give a basic introduction. When you write back, will you tell me of yourselves? Your hobbies, the things you are good at, the things that annoy you, your lessons. I personally love sparring, I hate arithmetic lessons but history is interesting, and I also really love going riding with my cousin Rob. I truly hope you are both happy and loved, and I look forward to meeting you both one day. Until then, I hope we can exchange many more letters like this one. Not like this one is pathetic. I hope we can exchange much better letters than this one. Please write back. With hope, your nephew. J. After sealing the letter, John stared at it in silence, cheeks gradually becoming hotter and hotter. It was awful. What would they think of him? He wanted them to like him, not only that but he wanted them to trust him as their head of house despite his young age and the fact he knew nothing about them. Should he rewrite it? But he still had no idea what to say to these strangers, his last living relatives from his father's side. Ashamed, John flopped onto his bed with watering eyes and burning cheeks. He would give the letter to Prince Oberyn. There was no other choice. Any first letter he wrote would be ridiculous, stupid, but it would open the gateway to many more deeper and more personal ones. Hopefully. He didn't need their love or trust or loyalty now, it would be many years before he met them, many years before he would take the throne. And he was still a child, he couldn't be kingly no matter how hard he tried. He didn't know what kingly even meant. He would figure it out. There was time. There was plenty of time and he had plenty of family members and allies who would help and support him, even without this written correspondence to his exiled aunt and uncle. All would be well. He would learn. Chapter 14. Hello. I am back with the next chapter. Now this is the last chapter of what I consider the prologue / the setup, and the next 6 to 10-ish chapters will be scenes for the next 7 or so years. The proper story will pick up again at canon time, with the death of Lord Arryn. I know that the past few chapters have been posted about a month apart from each other, and before that there was no update for like a year, and thank you so much all for your patience, but I must say that I'm unsure when the next updates will be. I am writing them as we speak, but I'm struggling with the order of which to write them and post them. I'm actually writing 2 of them at the same time, lol. It's a bit difficult because they are not really important, they are just scenes that show the regular lives of the characters, there's no invasions, there's no plotting, nothing really exciting, and yet they are also super important because they are showing the growth and the changes that the characters go through over a fairly long period. But anyway, I shall keep working on the next chapters and hopefully you won't have to wait too long, but in the meantime here you are. In this chapter we have 2 brand new POVs and we get to witness the long-awaited Northern Games. Please comment and let me know what you think. Despite their significant role in the rebellion and their lord's closeness with the king, the North has been granted no rewards from the crown. No gold, no tax breaks, no lowered tariffs on trade and no positions at court. Everyone else that took part in the rebellion has gotten something in return, but not the Starks. And yet, they are more powerful today than they have ever been in their history, even when they were kings in their own right. Yes, all thanks to the ingenuity of one man, if the stories are to be believed. They are plotting something. Tyrion scoffed. They are Northerners, father, what could they possibly be plotting? If they wanted power, they would have requested boons after the rebellion. As you said, they played a great part in the war and they are close to the king. They could have been given even more than us. Tywin's glare was smoldering and the dwarf almost flinched. He managed to keep his head held high and his eyes straight, though. Small victories. You are blind as you are short. Tywin retorted. Ned Stark has formed an alliance with the Martells and the Tyrells, enemies of the throne both. He has vastly increased the North's wealth with the help of his allies, and he spent the entirety of his stay at Riverrun before the Ironborn rebellion trying and failing to avoid the king. It is well known that they argued over the deaths of the Targaryen children, deaths that I ordered, and I am not as idiotic as to believe that all has been forgiven as our fool of a king clearly does. He is up to something. Tyrion sighed and took another sip of his wine. Anything to show his father his disinterest, false though it may be. And what do you wish to do about it, father? Me. Nothing. Tywin smiled, and the young man's gut clenched. You will go north. These northern games offer us a great opportunity to infiltrate Winterfell. You will keep an open eye and report back everything you see. And Tyrion. You will take along a few other lords to keep an eye on you. You will not fail me. Those were the last words that Tyrion heard from his father, a whole week before he departed Casterly Rock to voyage north. The Lannister lord wanted to know everything, the state of the North in general, of the Starks in particular, the relationship between the Stark family members, their relationship with the wild Greyjoy girl, who came to view the games, and how close they seemed to the Starks, the subject of any conversations Tyrion may overhear. The list went on. But Tyrion was really only here to see history in the making. Down below, a man at least 3 times Tyrion's height paraded around with his arms above his head, smiling wide as the common folk screamed wildly at him. One would think he had already won the competition. Finally, after whole minutes of the man's posturing, he made his way to the small grassy circle that lay near the center of the arena, wiped his hands of any sweat and knelt to the ground so his thighs were almost touching his chest. Supposedly, this was the best position from which to lift heavy objects. Tyrion wouldn't know, they had servants for that at the rock. The man, some Umber's cousin's second or third son or some such, gripped the boulder at the bottom and pushed with his legs until he was standing, the huge rock cradled against his broad chest. Tyrion leant forward in his seat and held his breath in anticipation, until the man spun and hurled the boulder into the air, along the strip of grass, with a huge roar. There was silence as it soared through the air, noblemen and common folk alike keeping their eyes glued to the rock until it landed, squarely in the center of the strip of grass. The stands erupted once more into cheers and screams of victory, and Tyrion leaned back into his seat with a satisfied smile, clapping politely along with the others in the Lord's dais. Amazing Lionel spoke next to him, though his voice was anything but amazed. Tyrion didn't turn towards him. We just watched the 6th man in a row throw a stone. Incredible. Mesmerizing. How far we've evolved, I say. Are you not enjoying yourself, Lord Lionel? The dwarf asked, if only to keep the fool from continuing on in even a louder voice. Harold scoffed. Enjoying ourselves? My lord, we're freezing our asses off watching some up-pumped little savages run around in circles and throw rubbish around. The dwarf glanced at his countryman before returning his attention to the spectacle, continuing his clapping until the Umberman walked out to the side of the arena. You should perhaps speak more loudly, Lord Harold. I don't think the Starks quite heard you. Indeed, the Starks, seated a few benches higher and to the center, were entirely focused on their children's excited babble. However, a few of the other lords sat closer to them were throwing the Westerlanders side glances and glares. Little Michael Redfort, just a boy of 12, was clenching his little fist as he glowered at them. Thankfully, Lords Lionel and Harold seemed to simmer down at this, slumping back into their seats and muttering under their breaths as a 7th man built like an ox took his place upon the grass circle. A sense of frustration poured over the little Lannister. Here he was, witnessing the first competition of its kind, and he couldn't even enjoy himself because of his father's task and these 2 baboons beside him. He had hoped he would be granted a little enjoyment even while he fulfilled his father's wishes. He had kept his senses keen. He had exchanged insightful and quite enjoyable conversations with the Stark boy and his bastard cousin. He had sat and watched as a strange group of northern boys along with Loras Tyrell and Michael Redfort, and inexplicably, even one northern girl, taught the Tyrell, Royce and a few northern girls how to throw a punch and effectively cripple a boy's manhood. He had observed the Greyjoy girl, from afar. When he approached he had been told to go fuck a boar, if he was capable of even reaching it. How uncouth, and her lack of positive interaction with anyone other than the oldest Martell bastard. He was doing his job. Tyrion was gathering intel as his paranoid father had demanded, and all he asked in return was some relaxation. Some time to enjoy a show, a good meal, an evening at the brothel. But no. Fucking Lefford and Westerling had to hound him, stick by his heels like dogs, pester him into writing reports every evening, compare notes on what they had observed, all the while insulting and critiquing everything they saw north of Moat Cailin any time they had an opportunity. The Lannister continued to stew even as they announced the winner of the boulder throwing contest, some mason from the mountain clans, and his frown was so pronounced that the serving girl that came to give them their platter of bread and cheese squeaked in fear and scurried away after depositing her tray. A few more minutes of listening to his companions complaining under their breath had Tyrion throw his bread back onto the tray and jump down from his cushioned bench. Idiots, the lot of them, moaning over cheese. It was the same fucking cheese they had in the Westerlands, made from the mountain goats of the Iron Islands. Little Sansa Stark ran past him as he made his way through the dais, closely followed by one of the Sands and the Royce girl, all squealing and giggling away as Loras Tyrell roared in outrage and his sister laughed daintily from her seat. The mischief of children. It made the dwarf smile slightly, a smile that quickly disappeared as he remembered that his father would be eager to hear of how the children of houses spread wide across the realm were playing together. A planned arrangement, the old bastard would probably call it. Children simply couldn't be children in his eyes, everything had to have some nefarious purpose. Plastering a pleased smile on his face, Tyrion made his way past the Tyrells and the Martells, nodding at each and smiling a little wider at the children, before coming before the Starks. Lord Tyrion. Lord Stark hollered, a small uptick of his lips showing his immense satisfaction. How are you enjoying the festivities? Very well, Lord Stark, I wish to convey my congratulations to you and of course your lovely wife that concocted the fabulous idea. The dwarf bowed to both Lord and Lady and Catelyn dipped her head in thanks, a happy gleam in her eyes. Thank you, my lord. Would you like to take a seat? The lady responded, sweeping a dainty hand to her right to indicate the bench beside her husband. The boys, Robb and Jon beamed at him and wiggled to the side to give him space to sit between them and the Stark adults and Tyrion smiled wider, thanking them all. Attentions turned back to the arena as a dozen women stepped onto the track that ran the periphery. All were tall, with their hair held back and wearing breeches. He could only imagine what his companions were saying about the spectacle as the ladies got into their ready positions, ready to race around the stadium. Women, taking part in competition, wearing breeches, making a spectacle of themselves, what horror. Tyrion snorted at the thought. I must thank you my lord and lady, for opening up Winterfell to the realms for these games. The dwarf called over the chanting crowd. I had hoped that I would be able to attend this historical event, and I must say, I have not been disappointed. Thank you, my lord. Stark replied, similarly raising his voice to make himself be heard. I'm also very happy and pleasantly surprised at the success of the events. I admit, this entire thing is the product of my wife. She planned the events and began construction while I was fighting against the Ironborn. When I came back, I saw no reason to remove her from the project. Indeed. Tell me, Lady Stark, how did such an idea come to you? A gong sounded below and the competing women were off, sprinting down the track. The crowd screamed and the children beside him jumped from their seats, bouncing on their toes and yelling encouragements. Lady Stark followed the girls with her eyes, distracted from their conversation for a moment before returning half her attention to the dwarf. I admit, I took most of my inspiration from the tourneys of my youth. It is simply that Northerners do not value using war and battle as a form of entertainment. The real difficulty was finding other ways to showcase strength and skill while staying away from the more martial pursuits. These events are made to demonstrate physical strength, speed and accuracy, all in different manners. Yes, I can see. The previous task tested accuracy as well as strength, did it? Yes. Young Robb Stark slammed his hands down on the railing before him, screaming his little head off before launching himself into his equally enthusiastic bastard cousin's arms as the adults looked on in amusement. The race was over, one of the girls winning by a fair margin. That's Shella. Yes Shella. Shella. The boys yelled. Tyrion sent an amused glance to Starks. "Do the boys know this woman?" Ned nodded, sharing a fond look with his wife. "Aye, she lives in Wintertown. She is a sister of one of the castle's cooks." Shella wins this victory for House Stark and Winterfell. "Well then, my congratulations." The sudden return of seemingly the entire realm's children put an end to their conversation, though a fair few laughs were shared when a still bouncing Robb picked his sister up as she ran past, twirled her and set her back on her feet before rushing over to the Bolton boy. Only a few days into their stay and already Tyrion had a wealth of knowledge to take back south. The games had indeed opened the doors of Winterfell to the realm, and the poor Starks had no clue what kind of predators they had let within their walls. An event like this, people's guards were down, merriment broke all barriers, and if the adults remained tight-lipped, well, there were always children still new to the idea of a secret that he could, and had, interrogate. The Starks were closer than any family he had ever seen. It made him loathe his father even more when he saw this serious man spare a genuine smile for his children, ruffle a bastard's hair and call him family, and trust a woman with the most ambitious financial project seen in the north. They were a true family, tight-knit and unbreakable, their only weak link being the Greyjoy girl. The feral young lady didn't understand that she owed her life to Ned Stark and Jon Arryn. Though she was unlikely to be of any use to Tywin Lannister simply due to her sheer hatred of anyone and everyone, Stark or otherwise. There was much to observe indeed. Olenna Tyrell seemed to push both Loras and Margaery into Robb Stark's arms despite him having a bastard as a constant companion. The children of all families seemed to get on splendidly with the exception of the Mormont girl and the Umber heir. Sir Milton Redfort was in negotiations with Lord Bolton to foster Domeric in the Vale with his brother, and little Sansa Stark seemed to be the leader of a rebellion where the soldiers were girls under the age of 10 and the goal was to empty Winterfell's kitchens of oranges. The old lion would be interested to hear of the goodwill generated during the events and of the close relationship between the Stark, Tyrell and Martell adults. Mission accomplished. Now if he could only ditch these infuriating chaperones of his, he could finally have some fun. Margaery had never left the Reach before. She had been to see her cousins in Old Town and had marveled at the beautiful tower that her mother had once called home, and she had gone down to the town to browse the markets, but she had never been so far away from home. She knew a lot about the North. She had read many books and the Maester would often tell them stories of his childhood when he still lived at Deepwood Motte. She had thought she knew what to expect. She was wrong. They were now in the second week of their stay at Winterfell, on the last day of the events, and Margaery had perhaps never had so much fun. Lady Catelyn was a genius for planning all this and Lord Stark always had a kind word for her, and he never even glared at her grandmother when she was rude and told him to stop looking like his dog had eaten the last plate of sausages. Little Sansa was so sweet, giving her an orange segment when they first met, still half hiding behind her mother's skirts. She quickly came out of her shell though, and soon they were giggling and sharing stories as they sewed by the fire while their parents were in their meetings. And all the new friends she had made. She was meeting children from all over, that she may have never seen at all if it wasn't for these games. Lyra Mormont was an older girl that always glared at the bigger boys when they lingered too long, and she had incredible stories from Bear Island. Apparently her father was a bear. As were the fathers of all her sisters. Margaery didn't know a woman could have a child with a bear. Aelys Karstark on the other hand was much gentler. She took a while before coming out of her shell, but once the girls had managed to convince her to stop whispering, Aelys was one of those that laughed the loudest at jokes. She had a nice laugh. The Sand Girls were quite similar to Lyra, really. All of them were strong young women that stood like the Knights of the Reach, straight-backed, confident and loose, not like an elegant lady but a flexible fighter. At least that's what Loras said. The boys were quite nice too. Some of them had taken it upon themselves to teach the girls what an advance was from a boy, and then taught them how to get a boy to leave them alone. Margaery could now break a man's thumb using only her bare hands. Robb and Jon had also taken her to see the Godswood, and what a sight it was. It was darker than the one in Highgarden, and its face was sadder, but you could feel how old the trees were. It may have been her imagination, but there was power in these trees. Truly incredible. And yet she was confused. Margaery was smart, everyone said so, and she had grown up at her grandmother's knee, learning politics from the best player in the game. And things weren't adding up. Her grandmother had made it clear to both her and Laura's that they were to forge close friendships with the Stark children, John and Rob in particular. And Willa's letters, thorough as they may be, always mentioned Rob and John. It's not that they weren't nice, they were. They were funny, and mischievous, and smart, and good at the sword, and kind, but Margaery didn't understand. She was going to be queen one day. She would marry Joffrey Baratheon and rule by his side, the good Queen Alysanne reborn. So why did she need to get close to Rob? And for that matter, John was a bastard. Again, he was a very nice boy, incredibly pleasant to be around, but he didn't matter. The tale their grandmother spun about ensuring good relationships in order to preserve the favorable trade deals was valid, but did not require this level of mingling. Perhaps the Stark boys would pave the road to Prince Joffrey through Lord Ned and King Robert's friendship. Or Rob was a backup, in case a royal marriage was closed to them. She simply didn't know. This had her grandmother written all over it, plots upon plots, plans upon plans, secrets upon secrets. Margaery trusted her grandmother. She did. And she knew that she would be given the information she needed when she needed it. It was just so frustrating. Which was why she was currently crawling through the mud and hay on her hands and knees, having convinced the other young ladies to come along with her. A small act of fun rebellion, if you will. Indeed, 13 little girls, aged 7 to 14 were crawling in single file through the filth in order to get past the kennel master's station and into the kennels. Tomorrow was the last event, the hounds' obstacle race, and Margaery would be damned if she wasn't going to pet those dogs. Willers had told her they had all types of breeds. "Ow!" She heard from the front of the line. "Lyra, you're on my dress. You shouldn't have worn a dress in the first place." Lyra was right, they would all get into terrible trouble for dirtying their dresses like this. Mud could be washed out, but the various small tears they had all accumulated would have to be sewed back. Of course the dresses were made of simple wool, not a stitch of silk or lace anywhere to be found, and therefore much less valuable than any of the other dresses Margaery owned, but it was still finely crafted for the nobility and had taken several hours of labor. Lyra and Jorel Mormont were the only ladies with the foresight to wear breeches on their little adventure. Well, not all of us are so barbaric as to wear men's clothes. The first girl, Margaery thought it might be Zilla Royce, retorted. "Shut up!" Myra Whisper shouted from behind her. "If I get caught because of you two, I will kill you." The girls grumbled and muttered insults, but thankfully quieted down as they continued their advance through the kennels, keeping close to the wall. Margaery liked Myra, she was smart and kind, and had that straightforwardness that the North was famous for. Grandmother had said that when she was old enough, the Northerner would come south to act as handmaiden to Margaery. She was quite looking forward to it, and the two girls had bonded over Myra's future stay at Highgarden. Margaery had been sure to tell her all about the splendor of her home. "Wait. Be quiet." Wyler Mandaily called from the very front, and Margaery had to hold back a groan. Some of the other girls were not quite successful, Sansa even slapping her little hand against the stone floor. They were so close. They had finally reached the back of the kennels where the competing dogs were kept, and Wyler was even right up against the door to the large box that Willers had told her was meant to keep a whole pack instead of just a singular hound. They couldn't stop now. "What now?" Zilla demanded. There was silence for a moment, and Myra let out an impatient breath before Wyler finally responded. "Nothing," she said hesitantly. "I just thought I heard something." "Then let's fucking go." "Lyra." "Be quiet, Alis." The girls all moved to form a crowd around the box door while Wyler worked to slowly undo the creaking latch. She finally pushed the door slowly open, peeked her head around the corner, and promptly disappeared from sight with a muffled scream. There were various gasps and muted squeals from the group, but they pushed their way forward into the box, to find a frightened-looking Wyler surrounded and held tightly captive, a hand over her mouth. "Willers," Margaery whispered angrily. "What in the seven hells are you doing?" Indeed, her new friend was being held tightly against her older brother, while Laura's, John and Rob glared at the newly arrived girls. "What am I doing?" "What are you doing?" Willers hissed back. "You're making a racket, we heard you coming from miles away." "We were whispering," Sansa defended, in a voice that was slightly louder than Wise. Did you learn to whisper from Great Yon? Rob asked. The Reacher girl suppressed an irritated twitch. The Great Yon had become known over their visit as extremely loud, decidedly not capable of being discreet at all. Willers, could you let poor Wyler go now? Right, yes, sorry. As soon as she was free, Wyler took a step away from the boys and brushed the dust of her dress before coming to step behind Margary, her head held high and a pinched face that betrayed how ruffled she was. Margary waited until she was back with the group before turning to face the boys again. We're just here to see the dogs, she said in her most demanding voice, looking down her nose at her brother as if he wasn't almost a man grown but rather a cockroach. It always succeeded in making men flee when her grandmother spoke like that. So are we. Laura's replied, a smug grin on his face. In fact, your late sister. We've been here for almost an hour already. Nostrils flaring in silent outrage, the child pointedly ignored her brother and turned her gaze to the dozen dogs behind them, stomping off towards them with a gaggle of girls behind her. When she saw Willers hold out a hand as she walked past him, did she slow, remembering his lessons from back at High Garden. She approached slowly until she was a few paces away and then she crouched, reaching her hand out to the nearest hound and letting it choose whether it was interested in her or not, the girls following her lead and the boys watching silently. The dog, a middle-sized black and white thing with long fur, raised its head and sniffled from afar, reaching its neck further and further towards her until it could come no closer without getting up. It did so, attracting the attention of 3 of the others who similarly approached their large group of children. Before long, girls and boys alike were sat on the ground, scratching and stroking whatever fur they could reach while being trampled on by excitable puppies. Margary's face hurt from smiling so wide. They're so friendly. Sangza squealed, even as she leaned far back to avoid a tongue in the face. I was expecting most of them to keep their distance. Zilla agreed. It's because none of these are bred for hunting. The aggressiveness has been trained out of them. Willers replied. What are they bred for, then? Jarell asked. The Mormont ladies had explained on the way that due to the abundance of bears on Bear Island, all of their dogs were massive. Tall enough to reach a man's hip, thick and grisly enough to fight off predators, teeth as long as her pinky and sharp enough to rip flesh to shreds. They were certainly useful against invaders like the Ironborn or wildlings too. The sisters understandably had taken some time to be convinced to break into the kennels to pet the dogs. The black and white ones here are shepherds. Rob explained, pointing to 2 of the middling-sized dogs that Margary had approached first. They herd sheep into the direction the farmer wants when it's time to migrate grazing fields. They are very fast and incredibly intelligent. That one there, he pointed to one fluffy dog that was half sprawled over Laura's legs, is a sled dog, used in the coldest months of winter to carry people and goods when horses and carts cannot make their way through the snow. Not the fastest but certainly the most durable. Those 2 are herd protectors. They chase off predators that try to prey on sheep and cattle. And those are rat catchers. Zilla exclaimed even as she grabbed one by the cheeks and ruffled its ears. We have these in the Vale too. And in High Garden. I think this breed is fairly universal. I'd heard of shepherd dogs before but none of the others are familiar. Margary said, and Willers nodded beside her. What I wouldn't give to have some of these at High Garden. The young man sighed. Rob chuckled. Well, the sled dogs wouldn't do very well in the south, I think. Too warm. But we can introduce you to some of the breeders before you leave. As the other continued their conversation, Margary noticed that there was one person who hadn't said anything in the entire time she'd been here. Even Alice was quietly giggling with Sangza and Myra, but Jon Snow was solemnly stroking a shepherd's fur, not looking up, not smiling, not joining the fun at all. Jon, are you all right? Margary asked. The boy looked up in surprise, but before he had the chance to answer, Rob let out an explosive sigh. Don't mind him. He's just been told he's going to be squiring for one of your Reacher knights. The girls all gasped and a few even clapped their hands in excitement. Even Margary couldn't contain a smile, but she remained concerned. That's great, Jon. Zilla cried. Isn't it? Jon nodded, his eyes resolutely stuck to the dog on his lap. It's a great opportunity. I'll get to travel and see more of the 7 kingdoms, and being a squire is no small privilege. he said. Then what's wrong? He shrugged, still not lifting his eyes to meet theirs. I just don't want to leave home, I suppose. I'll miss my family, and I won't get to see Bran grow up, or even Arya. She's only just turned 3. You're not leaving yet, Jon. His cousin reasoned. You've still got a year before Sir Russell accompanies Willers back home. We'll just have to make the most of it. Make sure you make some memories with Arya before I usurp your place as her favorite brother. Jon cracked a reluctant smile at that and half-heartedly pushed Rob's shoulder. And you won't be alone. Willers added. Margaery and Loras will be there, and so will I. I can properly show you my aviary instead of just talking about it all the time. And we can continue our spas. Loras added. And I'll be going south too. Myra revealed. I'm to be one of Margaery's handmaidens. Oh Myra, congratulations. See Jon. You'll be surrounded. We won't give a second of free time to mope. And the ravens are yours whenever you want. Willers added, shooting his brother a censoring glare. You can speak to your family as often as you like. Share all your adventures with them. Jon was properly smiling now, and his pets had more life in them, his shepherd's tail thumping harder against the ground. Thank you all. He said. You're right. It's a great opportunity. I'll get to see and do so much, and I can write whenever I want. And I'll send Arya so many gifts you'll never take my place, Rob. The auburn-haired boy laughed and punched his cousin's shoulder. That's the spirit. Everyone descended into conversation, much louder than they should be considering they weren't allowed to be there, and if they were caught it would be all their hides, but Margaery's thoughts were spinning. She was happy Jon would be coming south soon, of course. The boy was a pleasure to be around. He was funny and serious in equal measure, thoughtful and mischievous, and he was always willing to go for a spa with Loras, always made time for her when she wanted a guide to see more of Winterfell and its neighboring town. But this had her grandmother written all over it. He was a bastard. Why was he selected for a squireship? Why did grandmother and Willers try to push her and Loras towards him and Rob? Why had grandmother gifted him a copy of the 7-pointed star in High Valyrian? It made no sense. Margaery forcibly took a deep breath. She could not get angry, she could not get frustrated. She was not privy to all of the information the older members of her family had, and there was surely a very good reason for everyone's behavior concerning the older Stark boys. Perhaps the magics had reawakened and the Stark children were wargs like the Stark kings of old. Perhaps they were unknowingly sitting on a mound of gold greater than Casterly Rock. Maybe they were not Starks at all but secret Blackfyre princes. It made no sense to fabricate wild theories if one lacked the proper information. Margaery would watch, she would play along, she would continue her work ingratiating herself with the Starks through Jon when he came south, and one day she would have her answers. Olenna Tyrell was the smartest woman in the world, and Margaery didn't doubt that if her plans came to fruition, House Tyrell would rise higher than they ever had been. The end.